Eros and Magic in the Renaissance by Ioan P. Couiliano. Foreword by Mircea Eliade. Ioan P. Couiliano, a historian of religions and a specialist in late antiquity and Gnosticism, as well as a Romanist and an expert on the Balkans, teaches, among other subjects, the history of Romanian culture at the University of Groningen. He has become known for many articles in scholarly journals and for 3 volumes, the most recent being Religione e Potere, Turin, 1981, written in collaboration with 2 young Italian researchers. But it is with Eros and Magic, pending the publication of an extensive comparative monograph on myths and techniques relating to ecstasy, that his most important works begin to appear. Remembering that the Italian Renaissance was one of my youthful passions, and that I had chosen for my thesis the ideas of Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and Giordano Bruno, the author asked me to write a short foreword to Eros and Magic. I was tempted to enlarge upon the stages and great names of modern historiography concerning the Renaissance, emphasizing, for instance, recent re-evaluations of Hermetic, occult, and alchemical traditions. What a fascinating field of study in the history of thought is the analysis of interpretations of the Italian Renaissance, from Jacob Burckhardt and Giovanni Gentile to Eugenio Garin, P. Oscar Cristella, E. H. Gombrich, F. A. Yates, D. P. Walker, Alan G. Debus, and the other distinguished scholars of our day. Alas, at my age, time and energy are limited. Hence I shall not discuss the author's most significant interpretations, but shall confine myself to stressing their originality. I should like to mention, for example, the analysis of a little-known work by Giordano Bruno, De Vinculis in Genere, of enchainment in general, that Couiliano compares to Machiavelli's The Prince. Indeed, if Ficino identified Eros with magic, for he wrote, "The task of magic consists in comparing things to one another," Giordano Bruno carries to their final conclusions the operative possibilities of erotic magic. Everything can be manipulated by the imagination. That is, by phantasms, erotic in origin and nature, that arise in a subject or community, provided the manipulator be immunized through magic against his own phantasms. Quite rightly, the author recognizes in the technique expounded in De Vinculis the direct forerunner of a modern discipline, applied psychosociology. The magician of De Vinculis is the prototype of the impersonal systems of mass media, of oblique censorship, of worldwide manipulation, and of the brain trusts which exert their hidden influence upon the masses. I have cited this example on the one hand because De Vinculis is still little known, but also because shortly after Giordano Bruno's death, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation successfully imposed total censorship over expression of the imaginative faculty. The reason was, of course, religious. Phantasms were idols conceived by the inner sense, and to be sure, censorship succeeded in wiping out the sciences based on the strength of the imagination, especially fanciful eroticism, the art of memory, and magic. Moreover, according to the author, it was the Reformation's victorious offensive against the imagination that culminated in the destruction of Renaissance culture. That censorship over the imagination, which motivated the churches of the West, might be compared to the iconoclasts' attack on the Eastern Church in the 8th and 9th centuries. The theological argument was the same, the idolatry inherent in the glorification of images. On the other hand, the iconophilic theologians laid stress on the continuum between the spiritual and the divine. The incarnation annulled the interdiction against portraying the divine. Fortunately, the Synod of 843 definitively re-established the cult of icons. Fortunately, because it was the contemplation of images that gave the faithful access to a whole universe of symbols. In the final analysis, images could complete and deepen the religious instruction of the illiterate. Actually, iconography fulfilled this function with regard to all rural populations of Eastern Europe. Along with most historians, Ioan P. Couiliano believes that, on the theoretical level, the gigantic censorship of the products of imagination results in the advent of the exact sciences and of modern technology. Other researchers, on the other hand, have borne witness to the role of creative imagination in great geniuses of Western science, from Newton to Einstein. It does not behoove us here to address this complex and delicate problem, for creative imagination plays a decisive part, especially in the progress of mathematics and theoretical physics, less so in the natural sciences and technology. Rather, let us keep to Couiliano's observations on the survival or reappearance of a certain magic in the modern sciences of psychology and sociology. It is significant that this book, which begins with the history of the concept of inner sense from Aristotle to the Renaissance, should end with the legend of Faust in the interpretations of Marlowe and Calderon. These two writers exemplify, though in different ways, the rise of Puritanism. Their literary imagination was laboriously curbed by what the author calls an excessive moralism. Introduction. It is still commonly thought that a chasm separates our contemporary view of the world and ourselves from the concepts held by Renaissance men. The manifest sign of this cleavage is supposed to be modern technology, fruit of quantitative science, which began to develop at the end of the 17th century. Though the most eminent authorities on the history of science tell us that the subject matter of a Newton, a Kepler, a Descartes, a Galileo, and a Bacon has absolutely nothing to do with this so-called quantitative science. Nevertheless, the same mistaken opinions of our rationalist 19th century forebears continue to be held. They, after all, firmly believed in the idea of reason and of progress, which they defended to the bitter end. To posit the existence of a hiatus between the infancy of mankind, which ended with the Renaissance, and its maturity, culminating with the advent of modern technology, served at that time to bolster the socio-political aims of our partisans of progress, who thought they were, or who actually were, surrounded by hostile forces. But nowadays, when the obvious proofs furnished by technology take away the usefulness of too nostalgic a view of the past, it is absolutely essential to overhaul from top to bottom this attitude whose falsity has to be concealed by intolerance. The concept we moderns have of magic is very strange. We see it merely as a ludicrous heap of recipes and methods stemming from primitive, unscientific notions about nature. Unfortunately, the few specialists who venture to explore this realm carry with them, as their only equipment, the same prejudices. The works which break with this persistent pattern can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Of course, it would be difficult to maintain that the method of magic has something to do with the method of our natural sciences. The structure of matter is completely ignored, and physico-chemical phenomena are ascribed to occult cosmic forces. Yet magic has in common with modern technology that it claims to arrive, by other means, at the same ends: long-distance communication, rapid transport, interplanetary trips are some of the magician's current exploits. But it is not on this level that magic has continued to exist, mocking those who thought it had disappeared long ago. Indirectly derived from it are today's psychological and sociological sciences. That is why it is necessary first to have a correct picture of the essence and the methodology of magic, to be able to form an idea of what we still owe to it. The magic that concerns us here is theoretically a science of the imaginary, which it explores through its own methods and seeks to manipulate at will. At its greatest degree of development, reached in the work of Giordano Bruno, magic is a means of control over the individual and the masses based on deep knowledge of personal and collective erotic impulses. We can observe in it not only the distant ancestor of psychoanalysis, but also, first and foremost, that of applied psychosociology and mass psychology. Insofar as science and the manipulation of phantasms are concerned, magic is primarily directed at the human imagination, in which it attempts to create lasting impressions. The magician of the Renaissance is both psychoanalyst and prophet, as well as the precursor of modern professions such as director of public relations, propagandist, spy, politician, censor, director of mass communication media, and publicity agent. The workings of fantasy in the Renaissance are more or less complex. Eroticism is the most important, already apparent in the natural world without human intervention. Magic is merely eroticism applied, directed, and aroused by its performer. But there are other aspects of the manipulation of phantasms, one of them being a miraculous art of memory. The bond between eroticism, mnemonics, and magic is indissoluble, to such an extent that it is impossible to understand the third without first having studied the principles and mechanisms of the first two. In studying imagination at the time of the Renaissance and the changes it was to undergo in the Reformation, I am something of a pioneer. Yet would be naive to maintain that my book has no connection with the whole tradition of studies about history and philosophy of science, whose optical illusions it sometimes tries to correct. It goes without saying that the subject matter whose historical vicissitudes are to be examined in the course of this work is human imagination, as revealed in documents relating to eroticism and magic in the Renaissance. Sometimes it will be impossible to avoid taking into consideration the magician's pretenses in performing feats which are out of the ordinary. As a result, it will be impossible not to compare such pretense, whose validity is not at issue here, to the accomplishments of modern science and technology. Magic and science, in the last analysis, represent needs of the imagination, and the transition from a society dominated by magic to a predominantly scientific society is explicable primarily by a change in the imaginary. In that respect, this book is innovative. It examines changes at the level of the imaginary rather than at the level of scientific discoveries. Granted, of course, that a discovery is only made possible by a certain horizon of knowledge and beliefs conducive to it. Nowadays, if we can boast of having at our disposal scientific knowledge and technology that used to exist only in the fantasies of magicians, we must allow that, since the Renaissance, our capacity to work directly with our own phantasms, if not with those of others, has diminished. The relationship between the conscious and the unconscious has been deeply altered, and our ability to control our own processes of imagination reduced to nothing. It is interesting not only to learn about the relationship between Renaissance man and his own phantasms, but also to understand the ideological reasons that caused them to evolve in the way that they did. What this amounts to is a correct understanding of the origins of modern science, which could not have appeared without the existence of factors able to cause modification of man's imagination. Those factors were not economic, nor did they stem from a so-called historical evolution of our race. On the contrary, the forces that produced them were regressive on the psychosocial level and even reactionary on the socio-political level. Well, how can it be, then, that we owe to those forces the advent of the spirit that was to lead, step by step, to the rise of modern science? This is the enigma of history that this book attempts to solve. To forestall uneasiness on the part of the reader when confronted with statements which are too shocking, primarily that we continue to live in a world in which magic still has a part to play and a place of honour, we have let the texts speak for themselves. We have, in the reader's behalf, assumed the burden of understanding them in letter and in spirit. After all, the conclusions we have drawn seem to us adequate recompense for the painstaking study pursued for 12 years without interruption. Study involving philology only as a means, not as an end in itself. The fact that unremitting concentration on the meaning of documents has here supplanted mere reporting of their contents suffices to explain the individuality of this work, an individuality for which we do not believe we must apologize. We find ourselves today at the crossroads of two kinds of epistemology. The one, which goes back to the Age of Enlightenment, believes that scientific progress is cumulative and that, all things considered, mankind is supposed to discover truth. The other, only extant for a quarter century, believes that all worldviews are valid, that they are all far from truth, and that there is no continuity between them. According to that epistemology, the Renaissance concept of the world and that of modern science, though chronologically related, are not so in any other way. They are simply incommensurable with one another. Our research tends to confirm this point of view. Science in the Renaissance, whose most general principles are the only ones under examination here, is a coherent system based on the psychic, or rather spiritual, pneumatic, dimension of things. This dimension, as will be easily understood, is a real one. But are the intersubjective processes that magic says may exist also real? Yes, in a way. We have proof of it nowadays when manipulation through picture and speech has reached an unprecedented level owing to mass communication. But if there is a certain truth in the sciences at the time of the Renaissance, why did revolutionary change occur which affected and destroyed them from the 17th century on? Sociology has long since established the fact of a shift in vocational interests toward science and technology in Puritan England, bringing about the contact between scientific vocations and religious Puritanism. So it is that the range of Puritanism, which, according to Max Weber, was to lead to the forming of the spirit of capitalism, was broadened to include the creation of new spheres of social interest, able to explain the rise of modern science and technology. Yet we must be careful when ascribing to historic causes a definitive and primary character, for in most cases it is impossible to avoid circular reasoning. For instance, if we try to define the scope of capitalism, we cannot determine whether it is the product of religious reason that accedes to the idea of possession, or whether it is not the latter that wraps itself in religious reasons for purposes of self-justification. The dilemma is unanswerable: greedy reason or reasonable greed. Whichever it may be, the European scientific revolution that leads to the annihilation of the Renaissance sciences is caused by religious factors which have nothing to do with the sciences themselves. It is always religion that carries away European societies into risky ventures whose consequences we are still far from being able to evaluate. The historian with knowledge, however unpretentious, of different worldviews, the scientific system, technology, and the institutions of any of the great civilizations of the past must sooner or later reach the disturbing conclusion that all networks of ideas or collective or individual programs are equally valid, and consequently that the concept of the linear progress of mankind is essentially false. In the final analysis, every cultural system rests on myths, our own as well as that of the Renaissance, not accepting the exact sciences, as Stephen Toulmin has brilliantly demonstrated. And who, from the summit of the Palatine, would ever have dreamed that the Roman Empire was not eternal? Who, from the top of many an impregnable fortress or many a cathedral, would not have thought that the medieval world would last forever? This also applies, of course, to Giotto's Campanile. I have no time here to indulge in decadent feelings, but I was surprised lately by the question of a young archaeologist when we were admiring the magnificent buildings in Chicago. "Don't you think," she asked, "that someday all this will be nothing but rubble?" I had never thought of it, and I have not thought of it since. "There would be a lot of work for people like you," was all I replied. But her question opened up unfathomed deeps. Let the reader look into these deeps of history by himself. After all, this book is only a sowing of phantasms destined for an unknown reaper. It is he who will decide how to make use of it.